Okay, so I'm going to offer this kind of meta-narrative, which obviously cuts out a lot. Any map is like that. You know, a map illuminates some features of a territory and obscures others. So I'm offering you such a map. You could say that the universe that we live in, well, let's say the world that we live in, is built on stories. That the human realm, especially, everything or most of the things that affect our lives today are the result of unconscious, sometimes conscious, but usually unconscious human agreements, symbolic systems. So such a thing as the United States of America is essentially a story. It only exists because people have a shared set of beliefs and interpretations of various symbols and play roles that this story designates for them to play. You could say that a corporation is also a story. You could say that money is a story. You know, on the physical level, it's nothing. It's just some bits and computers. Social class, that is a matter of our perceptions that are filtered through the story that we live in. Race is another social construct that we could ultimately say is a story. There's not like a genetic, you know, determinant of, okay, you're this race and you're that race. So a lot of the things that create, and if you want to be a creator in the social world, then one of the most powerful ways to do that is through wielding the technology of story, as I like to call it. Unless, you know, it's a project that you can do with your own two hands, probably you're going to have to organize other people. And how are you going to do that? Well, you could use money, or you could, but one way or another, you have to enroll them in a common vision. You have to enroll them in a story too. So all of these things, money, politics, education, all of these institutions are built on the deep story that I call a mythology, that answers the questions that every human being at some time asks. The deep questions, such as, who am I? Why are we here? What is it to exist? What is a self? You know, what is a human being? What's our role on Earth? What's important in life? What's the purpose of life? What's valuable? How do I live? How do I create change in the world? How do things happen? Every culture answers this in a different way. And our culture has a story that basically says that who you are is a separate individual in a universe of other. And this universe doesn't have, the universe outside yourself doesn't have the qualities of a self, doesn't have beingness, doesn't have intelligence, doesn't have sentience, doesn't have desire and purpose. This is what our story has been telling us. Maybe animals do a little bit in this story, but not plants, and certainly not rocks, and clouds, and the planet itself. You know, that's just a bunch of stuff. So we are separate in a very, very fundamental way from the world outside of ourselves, and separate from each other too, because, you know, here's one self and there's another self. You know, two different souls encased in flesh, two different specks of consciousness looking out from two different meat machines. You know, to take the Cartesian view. You know, two genetically programmed expressions of DNA that seek to maximize reproductive self-interest, two economic actors seeking to maximize financial self-interest. You know, so religion, economics, biology, psychology, philosophy, I'm cutting a few corners here, but they all pretty much agree, or have agreed until recently, on what a self is. I would like to say that time, and so, okay. It's not only ideology that tells us that this is who you are. It's also our social systems, our institutions, our economy. You know, our economy sure makes it seem that your self-interest is separate from my self-interest, and maybe even in conflict with my self-interest. We're competing in the marketplace. We're competing for jobs. We're competing for scarce resources. So scarcity is another fundamental part of this story. And it sure looks like we live in a world of scarcity, where many people are barely hanging on, barely paying their bills. I mean, you can't, it would be very arrogant to walk into, you know, a village in Bangladesh or where, you know, half the people have sold their kidneys to make their debt payments, or to, you know, even an impoverished neighborhood in America. It'd be very arrogant to go in there with a new age ideology about you know, prosperity programming and say that, well, scarcity is not real. You know, it's just because of your beliefs, you know, generating the scarcity. That would be very arrogant. I mean, our lived experience is very, very much an experience of scarcity. And what I'm saying is that it's an artifact of the stories that run our system. Because on a systemic level, there isn't actually any scarcity. You know, something like 50% of all food in America is wasted. The largest irrigated crop in America is lawn grass. You know, so I mean, food is actually really abundant, but there's an artificial scarcity that prevents the food. I mean, something like 1 in 7 kids go hungry, you know, and hunger rises during the holidays because they're so dependent on school lunches and school breakfasts that during the holidays their parents don't have enough money to feed them. So is that because there's not enough food on this planet and not enough space to grow it? No. It's because they don't have enough money. But money is something that doesn't need to be scarce. Money is just a story. Our story has made it scarce. And that's just one example. The money system is just one example of how our institutions embody the story, embody the mythology of scarcity and the mythology of separation. As you may have noticed, it also puts you into competition with each other. Your well-being is separate from my well-being. If you get the job, I don't. And if you get sick or if you screw up, good news for me, because now I'm going to advance instead of you. So it's like, I'm not going to really speak much really anymore about economics, but one way I illustrate it when I do speak about economics is I invoke the metaphor of musical chairs. And what would happen, you know, if we gathered into a circle and there were fewer chairs than people, and we played that game, and the losers, like your kids, don't get to eat. Well, some of you would perhaps altruistically let someone else have your chair, knowing that you will lose your security, your home, et cetera, if you don't get a chair. Like, we're going to play the game for real. You know? Some of you might altruistically give it up. Others would be pushing and elbowing because, you know, I got to get a chair. Right? And that's kind of how our society is set up. And then the economist sits back and says, yup, there's human nature for you. You know, look how competitive they are. And he builds an entire theoretical edifice on that observation and on the assumption of scarcity, the two main assumptions. And the biologist says, yep, there they are, you know, seeking to maximize reproductive self-interest. But is that really human nature? That's what our story tells us. But is that really human nature, or is that just our response to the conditions that we live in? I think it's the latter. And I think if we built a society on a different story, that we would see a very different aspect of human nature dominate. That's why my work is, really, I see myself as a storyteller and a story disruptor. And I think that time banking is also a vehicle for the sowing of a new and ancient story in our society, because the experience in, well, certainly, say, the small town in New Hampshire, where you know, there's the Ryan kids and all these different families, you know, and everyone's helping each other out, you know, like the teaching that the world is fundamentally competitive and your good fortune is my bad fortune and more for me is less for you. That's nonsense in that arena, you know. something bad happens to your neighbor, and then who's going to take you to the hospital if you break a bone? Right? In a gift society, and that was a gift society, right? No, that's what a community is. A community is woven together with gifts. So that kind of precept of reality is, it doesn't make sense in a different system. So okay, like I said, it's not just an ideology, it's this way of thinking and way of being is induced by the world that we find ourselves in. And if we can create experiences that don't fit into that, we'll strengthen, we'll be laying the groundwork for a different story. So we can disrupt the old story, and time making can do that. Give people experiences that don't fit into that way of seeing the world. Give people experiences that touch on a potential abundance. You know, everybody could be helping each other out. Everybody could be sharing all of these things. Everybody's garages and basements are full of stuff that they're not using. You know, people have all this time, yet there's all these needs out there. Yet there's no way to connect the time and the needs. Well, now here's a way to do it. So it's not only repairing society, it's also kind of bringing back together the shards of our shattered selves. Because as we live into a real community, who we are, our experience of being changes. And we no longer see the world as a bunch of others out there. It becomes much more apparent that what we do to the world comes back to affect ourselves. If we're generous to others, then generosity, people want to be generous to us too. And I think time banking is kind of a first step toward rediscovering that. Eventually, once Richard Rockefeller babysits your kids for a few times, you know, maybe you'll stop, you know, and you'll be doing things for him, and maybe you'll stop keeping track, you know, maybe you'll stop using time dollars, because now you have a relationship, and you don't really have to keep track anymore. Because this isn't like some separate person with whom you're engaged in an interest maximizing transaction. You know, transactions happen between separate individuals, and it's only a very shallow first step to shift transactions from US dollars to some alternative currency. And it's an important first step, I think. And it also gets people thinking that, you know, there is an alternative. But it's part of a movement toward a different world-creating mythology and a different state of being that goes along with it, which I call it, you know, reunion or interbeing, which says that who you are is not a separate individual. Who you are is the totality of all of your relationships. That you are a microcosm of the entire world, and that the world outside of you, therefore, mirrors everything inside of you. So, everything you do affects everything else. Everything happening in the world is happening to you, and what happens to your neighbor or your someone in your community is also happening to you, and even what's happening to people in Gaza or Afghanistan, or the beings in the rainforests, or the forests themselves, that's happening to you as well, inescapably. In the old story, it's not inescapable at all. I mean, even if you might be affected by a rising crime rate, well, you can build a higher wall. You can insulate yourself from what's out there because you are fundamentally separate from that. And so we have a whole politics really based on controlling that which is outside of ourselves and insulating from us. And it takes a physical form when we decide to build walls and borders and fences and security systems and surveillance and all this kind of stuff. It's all about control. The program of control that says that this is another part of the mythology, and it directly comes from the experience of separation. The program of control says that well-being comes through controlling the natural world and all of these others, all of these competitors out there, and the more powerful you are, the more natural forces that we harness, the more we transcend nature, the better off we'll be as a species, and on an individual level, the more power that you gain to bend others to your will, for example, through money or through some other kind of hierarchical force. And the more guards you can hire, or the more servants, and the bigger the walls, and et cetera, then you'll be safe too. You'll be happy. And all of that is built into the mythology that we live in. And that story is unraveling. First, because it's just not working anymore. I mean, maybe it never worked, but at least we could pretend it was working for a while. You know, it looked like science and technology were making the world a better and better place, and we were going to just, conquer the harmful species and engineer the planet and make it, more and more of a paradise. And someday we'd have synthetic food, and we'd live like the Jetsons, without a living being around us, even a robot servant or a robot dog. Like that was the future. Synthetic food, robot body parts, and we were supposed to have conquered all disease by now, but it didn't happen. And so, and the same thing with the paradigm of development, where we were going to bring freedom and democracy and industrial paradise to every corner of the world. Like, we fully believed that, and maybe a lot of people still do believe that, but I think that even the elites no longer fully believe that ideology. There's kind of a weariness as they continue to go through the motions because they know nothing else. And occasionally they get a glimpse of something else, and it's scary to them. It's scary and it's alluring at the same time. And they say in private, I wish I could take your suggestion. I wish that I could do that, but what would my colleagues say? The whole culture that they're in. Polly Higgins was telling me about a CEO, a coal company CEO, who privately said to her, I don't even think this world should be mining any coal anymore. He was a CEO of a coal company. He's like, but if I say that in public, my board of directors will fire me, my middle management will revolt, they'll think I'm crazy. Meanwhile, half the middle management's probably thinking the same thing. And the groupthink is so strong that even if you step up and say this is wrong, the people who secretly agree with you will pillory you and run you out on a rail to prove that they entertain no such fantasies. But this is, so we have a society that no one really believes in anymore. That where we're going with this is to re-establish in ourselves the habit and the mentality of gift. Where you let go of the control over how that gift comes back to you. So it could be, in a very, very explicit way, I'm not going to patent it, I'm not going to copyright it, I'm not going to make it proprietary, I'm going to release the source code, I'm not going to establish economic control over this. That's one level of gift. But another level would even be to let go of the kind of social and intellectual and emotional control over it, like I'm the developer, I'm the guy who did it, it's my idea kind of thing. And then you stole my idea, or this kind of competitiveness. It also reveals the wounds that we carry from our long inculcation in the story of separation. I mean, these threads of the revolution going all the way to the bottom, all the way to our knowledge systems, even to our ways of knowing, to our relationships, how the maladies of our culture manifest inevitably in our groups and in ourselves as well, and how these are all related. This, for me, it's not. I'm not one of these kind of cynical, jaded pessimists that say, yeah, so we're just stuck. No matter how hard you try, you can't escape it. You're going to end up willy-nilly replicating your own internalized oppression in everything that you do, and that's just the way. This is just the human condition. I feel very strongly, I'm very convinced that this whole complex that involves all of these levels is a story that's reaching the end of its telling. And that even as we wrestle with the remnants, the structures of the old story, of the world that we've been brought up in, we're also being pulled towards something real that we can see, something true. And I think time banking is an example of that. It's a glimpse of the way that the world could be, and probably many of you have had experiences where I've heard some of the stories here where you're like, that's it, that's how it's supposed to be. And then the cynical mind says, well, even some of the stories about Richard Rockefeller, babysitting the children. Like, there's something really beautiful there. And the cynical mind might have all kinds of reasons why this will always be marginal and an exception to the ugly, grim reality that we've gotten used to. But there's another part of ourselves that sees it, that knows it as a glimpse of the future. And for me, the more strongly I stand in that knowledge, which is not something that I can accomplish through an act of will, standing in that knowledge. It's something that is given to me through the stories of other people and their seeing of what I see. That reminds me that I'm not crazy. But the more strongly I'm standing in that, then the more active I am, which is kind of contrary to the cynical realist, who can always give you a reason why what you're doing isn't going to make a difference, and it's impossible. And there's always a million reasons not to do it. But it's the naive person that does it anyway, and sometimes succeeds. We're not talking about it. So, I can give you various kind of logical reasons why, how and why time banking is part of the building of a new story, or how it can be one of the institutions that draws its strength from a story of interbeing, a story of gift, a story of service. Gift, like how does the universe work? Through the principles of gift, it's quite obvious how time banking is part of that upwelling, part of that new story. And I'll add to that, though, that let me say that isn't actually the reason that any of us are doing it. That part of the old story says the way to make choices in life is to kind of calculate the measurable outcomes and run this little min-max problem in your head as to what course of action is going to generate the most of what you want to create in the world. But I think we're deluding ourselves when we say that is why we're doing it. That's kind of it's a justification that sounds nice, but at least for me, it isn't really true. What happens for me is that something moves me, and I want to take action. And how do I know what action to take? It makes me feel good. It makes me feel alive. It makes me feel that my gift is coming out. And I might not, and usually I can say yes, and here's how it's going to rationally speaking how it's going to help the world, but sometimes I can't say it. Sometimes I can't say that I mean, gee, like, even like, yesterday I left early because I wanted to spend some time with my 9-year-old, Like, how is that going to help the world more than, making speeches or, making contacts or whatever I might do at a place like this? Like, so I guess what I'm trying to say, I speak about this often, that the small invisible things have just as much power as the things that you can say are having a big effect. That therefore we can't validate the work of the big-time politician or the book writer or the speech maker or the community activist even. We can't validate that over the single mom taking care of her 2 kids and also her grandmother at the same time and just living 24 hours a day in service. We can't say that that woman is doing less for this planet. We can't say that somebody working to house the homeless or working with recovering addicts or working in the prisons, doing nonviolent trainings in the prisons, maybe spending huge amounts of time just fighting to stop an execution of somebody who they believe is innocent or even who isn't innocent. We can't say it like rationally, what does that mean in the face of global warming? If you're what moves you is death row, how can we say that? And I think that this is really important in the context of time banking because there's kind of like maybe a leftist narrative that says that, yeah, you're just kind of making capitalism work a little bit better. You're kind of ameliorating the hard edge of capitalism, and yeah, it's very, very nice so-and-so's babysitting and not using money and so on, right? But how is that really changing the system? And what I'm saying is it is changing the system, and that's not what justifies it. It is changing the system because, well, for a lot of reasons. And I've already mentioned some of them. It's changing the story. It's giving us practice in different ways of thinking and different ways of sharing, right? It is changing the system from the narrative level on up. And that's not why to do it. Why to do it is because it's beautiful. And that motivation, I think, is a much deeper kind of revolution than a more clever system. Thank you.
It would really help us out if you subscribe, share, and comment. Thank you.